take on the new charge, and that we don't hang around and tell you that you should do it this way or that way. You have to find your own way. But in the last year or two, I've been thinking about that decision, and I haven't changed my mind about that except in one area. As some of you know, I'm Geechee, and I grew up in a little fishing village on the coast of South Carolina, and the old men in my village would sit on this old oak tree and talk about, the day, and talk to the young men in the village, like me. And I do think that those of us who have been around a while, even the young people who have been around a while, have a certain responsibility to be available, to talk to you about whatever you want to talk about, how you get this done or how you get that done. Because I know that the system is still as complicated as it was back then. One of the things we talk about in our course at Project Imhotep is survival in a hostile environment. And it could still be hostile for you, or at least the system could ignore you. And so at that point, having people to talk to is, I think, helpful. It was helpful for me. And I do want to at least make myself available, and I would encourage other people who've been around a while, and I will be making calls to people to see if we could just be available to those of you who would like to talk about how you get things done.
I have nothing to add right now.
I would say that all of us are stretched, especially being people of color, women of color, that we tend to be over, sought after in our departments, in our institutions. And to do well, for SAAPHI to do well, we have to kind of work from that knowledge and that awareness. So much of what we have had to do is kind of, roll with the flow, with the fact that we know that the ones in this room are really dedicated, and whether or not people are able to show up all the time is tied to not a level of interest, excuse me, but to all the different things that are pulling on us. And as someone who still very much remembers what my days were like as president and on the board, I know that would be very, very valuable. It would have been very valuable to have more of a structured influence, because you all actually were there every year, and we could always reach out to you. But I wonder if there might be some way to have something like an elder in residence on the board or something like that.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
So I would just agree with Bill's statements, and Bill knows. So I'm one of those people, when I was a grad student, would just barge into my PhD advisor's office unannounced. I don't care, I need 30 minutes. And so I did the same thing to Bill during my presidency, and I would call him every week, and I need help, how do we do this? I mean, we had a common mission of trying to finishing up the paper, but having that wisdom, because I've learned in academia, there are two groups of people who will take time and have time for you. One is your peers, so you're always writing together, you're reading together, you're shooting these ideas back and forth. And then it's the senior individuals who have a lot of institutional wisdom. I was fortunate that my academic grandfather, so my PhD's advisor, was at Michigan my first 3 or 4 years when I was there. So he would tell me a lot about the institution in Michigan, and just he didn't understand anything about the social determinants of health. If I could explain to him what I was trying to do, then he could help me tailor it to the audience that I was trying to present it to. And so the same thing happened with Phil, or even Lynn Tsai, who's older, if anybody knows him. And so I think having these senior elder members who have a lot of like knowledge of how things are different, how things are similar, you know, what we can do, because we're just out here, we just want to make a change, do something. But having the senior members help to channel that energy into positive action, I think it was very useful to me, and it would be very useful to you all.
Thank you. Currently on the board, we call them seasoned members. It sounds better. Senior. Seasoned. So I'd like to open up the floor if anyone has any questions. We actually don't have a handheld mic, but if you could come up and ask your question, and then we can get that answered. So if you want to just come up and then one by one. Yep. And just introduce yourself and tell us sort of where you are in terms of like student or early career professional.
Good morning. Thank you all for such enriching and lively discussion. I really appreciate it. So my name is Isabel Morgan. I'm currently a reproductive epidemiology fellow in the Division of Reproductive Health at CDC. And Dr. Jenkins, you mentioned there was a time when you felt like health disparities research was going off track. And I'd love to hear more about that.
I do want to start a conversation, maybe a little bit more assertive than a conversation. We should not be using the word race. You know, the problem in America is not that people look differently from each other. The problem in America is that people are treated differently because of the way that they look. And as long as people stand by and allow people to misdescribe what the problem in America is, as long as young people are not going to meetings at APHA and say, "Excuse me, sir, I'm trying to understand. Are you talking, you're saying that the fact that I don't look like you is the problem? Or is the problem the way you treat me the problem?" We've got to start being more assertive about what the problem is and how to define it. And I think too often we just accept what Confederates tell us, you know, and I think it's time to put an end to just accepting what Confederates tell us to believe. For example, you know, many of us grew up with cowboy movies and the native indigenous people were scalping Europeans. When in fact, what happened was British trading companies were paying mercenaries to scalp native people, and they got paid for every scalp they brought in. It was totally different and opposite than what you are told. And so we've got to rethink what some of these problems are. Another example is, you know, we met with the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, to talk about something we were coming up with called community participatory research. And the idea was that we would go into a community, find out what the community wanted to do, and then get support or finance to try to solve that problem. Well, community participatory research is the process by which people write a grant telling what they're going to do in the community, getting money for it, and then going into the community and saying, "This is what you're going to do. Can I get your advice?" Well, that's not the original idea of what we suggested this process should be. But there are very few of us who have gotten money from foundations and they say, "Okay, it has a few million, come back in a year and tell us what you think we ought to do." In fact, Diane and I might be the only two people that I know were able to do that. But we've got to think of actually involving the community in the research that we do. And there's a whole list that comes from those two things. But the main issue is to have people doing something that is hugely important, and that is to ask questions. Just ask questions. The most important thing that you could do is just ask a question. You might not even think the question is important or not relevant or whatever, But asking questions, training people to ask questions is really what this whole thing is about. And I think you'll come up with your own solutions once you start asking questions and getting answers.
So, naming racism. Naming racism is what you're talking about.
Yes.
But that we have to go beyond. And the question I asked to even get me to this point was, why do we see these so-called race-associated differences in health outcomes, and what is race actually measuring, and recognizing it was some rough proxy for social class because of institutionalized racism, right? Rougher for culture. We think about race is this social thing, and there are cultures and ethnicities within each race, right? So rougher for culture, meaningless for genes, but a precise measure of the social classification of people in our race-conscious society. So you all may know that last year, as president of APHA, I launched our association on a national campaign against racism. The way I did that was to, in all of my travels to the affiliates and all of my colleagues address that, and we are still trying to figure out how we establish this anti-racism collaborative with 8 collective action teams that we have outlined, and SAAPHI, I think, is going to have a big role in actually getting that going, along with other organizations. The American Public Health Association's social network platform is going to be insufficient because it's a members-only platform, and also we don't have the staff and all for that. But I would just say this National Campaign Against Racism has 3 tasks. The first is naming racism. The second is asking the question, how is racism operating here? And when you ask that question, you need to look at the elements of decision-making. Structures, which are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table, who's not, what's on the agenda, what's not. Policies, which are the written how of decision-making, practices and norms, the unwritten how of decision-making, values, the why. And then the third aspect, name racism, ask how is racism operating here, and then organize and strategize to act. That is what the structure of SAAPHI enables us to do, and all the other structures in which you need to get involved. So I wanted to say that, and I wanted to talk about, in general, here's a challenge to you all. There are 3 huge societal barriers to achieving health equity, dismantling racism and other systems of structured inequity, all of that. There are 3 huge societal barriers. The first is our society's very narrow focus on the individual, which makes systems and structures either invisible or appear to be irrelevant. We could talk about that for an hour. The second is that we as a nation are ahistorical, right? We act as if the present were disconnected from the past and that the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance, right? And so we need to address that. And even already we've been talking about history and the role of not being ahistorical. This panel is an example of not being ahistorical, right? The structural role that you're suggesting for a senior advisor on the board is that. The third huge barrier is this myth of meritocracy. The story that goes something like this: if you work hard, you will make it. And we know that maybe most people who have made it have worked hard. Not everybody who's made it has worked hard, but maybe most of them have. But there are many, many other people who are working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field. So we need to, to the extent that we don't say the word racism, we are denying racism, right? To the extent that you're not anti-Confederates, as you say, then you are complicit with their world and their worldview. So denial of racism, which you can do 2 ways, by saying I don't think racism exists, or by never saying the word, is shoring up this myth of meritocracy. Because if you do not acknowledge the uneven playing field and how it was created and how it's being perpetuated, then the storyline goes, those people must be lazy or stupid or whatever when you're looking at the so-called health disparities or the gap. So I'm throwing out to you, I don't have all the answers of how we organize our work as researchers or as SAAPHI or as in your community, as politicians, if you're going to do that, whatever it is. But these 3 huge societal barriers are narrow focus on the individual, the ahistorical nature of us in this society, and this endorsement of the myth of meritocracy. Maybe you can start asking questions about that to guide your action.
I just want to mention briefly that we all talk about racism in the field broadly now, as if it's common and comfortable and everyone knows this. But these folks here were saying when it was not popular. And that's what enabled me to feel like I could say it in my work. So when I was working on my dissertation 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't know when it was. Approaching my tenure track position as I may not get tenure, in fact I'm likely not to get tenure doing this work, so let me hurry up and do it in case I don't. I just mentioned that because there might be a tendency sometimes to see gray hair and assume people are kind of calm and not really all that radical. But clearly SAAPHI does not fit that mold, and SAAPHI has been very bold, and so when I think about legacy and what is needed to carry on the legacy of SAAPHI, part of what I want to challenge us, especially the next generations, to do is to be bold in the work that you do, not to apologize, not to hold back.
Right. And just to add to Chandra, there are still institutions and departments where you still can't say racism, you still can't say discrimination, but still be bold anyways and take Chandra's course of action and get it out now while you can. But you'll be surprised that, as long as you're still getting funded and you're being productive, it's not as, there's a lot of individual level strife that you may have to deal with, but the institution as a whole, which I found is, they have absolutely nothing, they don't know anything about these social determinants, they don't see the system, and to have people, particularly now that the system has become more obvious based on our current political situations, people are more open to hearing this, even news reporters. So when the USDA came out and changed the food recommendations that they're having in schools, you can have more salt in the food, you can have more sugar in the milk. They did not see how this would disproportionately affect students of color. I'm like, well, who do you think is on school breakfast and lunch? And they're like, oh. But then they'll spin it like, well, that's a great spin to this story. Like, wait, spin? Wait, what? Right. But it's just interesting how, I have to, in my fields, break it really down and get them to ask the questions that Bill was talking about. Like, well, who do you think this is going to affect? And why do you think it's going to affect them? And what's a better solution to that? And I think SAAPHI, again, the training that you get from these meetings will give all of you the courage to take that to your own fields, whether it's in public health or outside of public health.
I'm going to tell a little story. So the meeting that resulted in the development of SAAPHI was entitled "The Mortality and Morbidity Gap, Is It Due to Race or Racism?" And we got support from CDC and other places. And then after we put the title out, the Deputy Director of CDC, Glenda Coward, maybe I shouldn't have called people's names, but anyway, what the hell. She called me and said, well, I don't think we can support this meeting if you have the word racism in the title. And I said, oh, of course, no problem, we'll take it out. We did it. I mean, what was she going to do after, it got all out? So, yeah, you just have to take risks you have to.
Let me say one more thing.
Yeah.
And so you have to take risks knowing that it might have consequences, but if you have a question that you're trying to answer that's important to you, or a mission that you're trying to accomplish that's important to you, then you can take that same agenda in different settings, right? So don't be so tied to the setting where you are that it is going to truncate or misshape your work or your question. You have to be willing, if you're devoted to answering that question or doing that work, to say, okay, if you can't handle me now, I have to go someplace else. And I've done that in my career. When I was an assistant professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, I would be writing these grant applications that, racism, this and that, and people aren't supposed to give you like a backline feedback. You either get the money or you don't, but people were calling me and saying, well, couldn't you just change that word racism to discrimination or something, and I refused. So I wasn't getting the funding. So after 6 years, I did pretty well at Harvard School of Public Health, but I wasn't bringing on that funding. So then I was recruited to CDC, so I went there. My first 10 years at CDC were fine. Last 4 years, I moved to a different part of CDC, and the people there thought if racism belonged anywhere at CDC, which they highly doubted, they certainly knew it didn't belong in that part of CDC where I had been moved, right? And they tried to kill me. If I thought that I was going to include my Gardner's tail allegory or the cliff analogy in a talk, if I even thought that I might include that, I could not do that at CDC work because those were not scientific. Even though anybody else in the association, as in the agency, could be using my work. I had to apply 30 days in advance to the ethics office to do the thing as an outside activity and use my own vacation annual leave time to do it. They were trying to, so after a while, they almost did, and then Dr. Satcher rescued me over to the Morehouse School of Medicine. This is how it's important to know people and to have a larger network. I don't only know people at Harvard. I know people at CDC, so Diane, Bill's wife, brought me. Here she is, there's Diane. Diane brought me to CDC, right? Then I'm at CDC this exact. I don't only know people at CDC, I know Dr. Satcher. You know what I'm saying? If you are willing to stay true to the work or the question or the mission or whatever it is, then sometimes it's going to have impacts on your setting, but you will continue with the work. And so I just be strong in that as well.
Good morning. I am Victoria Revelle, public health practitioner and certified health education specialist. I got my training in public health from Morehouse School of Medicine, so I want to thank you all. I can't thank you enough. Without these 4 individuals and so many other people that are unnamed, the program would not have existed for me. I also did the rest of my work in community health leadership at the Satcher Health Leadership Institute. So once again, thank you. My question as we begin to close this morning is surrounding internal motivation and drive. Each of you all have touched on so many great points that I think we can all be extremely thankful for, and we've learned a lot from this morning. But if you could give us closing words of wisdom that we can think on and meditate